There's been so much hype around vitamin D, and unfortunately, most of the studies have been disappointing in terms of its actual benefits, but a brand new study reveals an area where it's actually super helpful, and researchers found it cut sick days by nearly 20%. They discovered though that we have to get the dose right, so in this video I'll explain the study and the current guidelines when it comes to the proper dose. Most people know that vitamin D is linked to bone health, but it's also a key regulator of processes related to our immune system, muscle function, cell growth, and sugar metabolism. Most tissues in the body react to vitamin D in some way, and that's led researchers to explore how low levels of vitamin D might relate to a whole host of health problems. And once we started looking, we found associations everywhere. The early evidence appeared from observational studies, so this is a kind of study that involves watching people in the real world to see how particular metrics, like blood levels of vitamin D, correlate with health outcomes. And the results showed an association between low vitamin D and cancer, infectious diseases, autoimmune conditions, diabetes, and heart disease. And at the same time, experts were warning that a large number of people were deficient in this key nutrient. So an article in 2006 summed up the evidence. More than a third of healthy young adults had low vitamin D levels, and for those seeking medical care, the number jumps to a whopping 57%. So there was a growing awareness of the importance of vitamin D, along with claims of widespread deficiency. So that prompted the Endocrine Society to publish a set of influential guidelines in 2011. The guidelines established threshold for deficiency and sufficiency of vitamin D levels in the blood, and they also recommended fairly broad testing to check these levels for those at risk of deficiency. And they said that supplementing with vitamin D at levels of up to 2,000 international units a day or higher might be needed for some people. Those recommendations and others like them have led to a dramatic impact. Vitamin D supplements are now incredibly popular, and the global vitamin D market is projected to reach $1.5 billion by 2034. But since those guidelines were published in 2011, we've gathered a lot more data on vitamin D and its relationship to health, and it's mostly been disappointing. Even the Endocrine Society has revised its advice. So here's what happened. First, let's look at the correlation between low vitamin D and health problems like cancer. So initially, it was thought that vitamin D was playing a causal role here. So that would mean that supplementing with vitamin D could help avoid these problems. But this raises a key issue with observational studies. So correlation is not the same thing as causation. So everyone knows that grey hair, for example, is associated with getting older, but that doesn't mean that grey hair causes aging, and we're not going to stay youthful if we suddenly start dyeing our hair. So here's the issue with vitamin D. Does deficiency cause ill health, or is it merely correlated with it? So for example, older adults in rest homes spend the majority of their time inside, and as a result, they will have low vitamin D. On the other hand, healthier older adults who don't need to be in a rest home and spend more time outside, their vitamin D levels will be higher. So in that scenario, low vitamin D levels will correlate with poor health, but they don't cause it necessarily. This is why we always need to test ideas generated by observational studies with controlled trials, and that's exactly what researchers have been doing with vitamin D. So what have they discovered? Well, one area of investigation has been heart health. The large VITAL trial looked at the effects of daily vitamin D supplementation over a 5-year period in a group of over 25,000 older adults, and during the follow-up, they recorded how many heart attacks there were. Their conclusion? Vitamin D supplements did not reduce the rate of heart attacks. They also didn't bring down cancer rates, which has been another key area of interest. And a study published 2 months ago backed up that finding about cancer. It was based on a trial of over 20,000 adults who took vitamin D supplements for up to 5 years. Researchers found that cancer rates for the vitamin D group, they were the same as the control group. And then there's all-cause mortality, so that gives us a broad measure about the impact of vitamin D supplements on health. A large Cochrane review of 56 trials in 2014 gave us some reason for initial excitement. It found a small but statistically significant decrease in all-cause mortality with vitamin D supplements. The risk of death was about 3% lower. But more recent evidence from large-scale trials paints a completely different picture. A meta-analysis completed in 2020, for example, found that vitamin D supplements made no difference to all-cause mortality. These studies, and others like them, have cast serious doubt about the idea that we all need to be megadosing vitamin D to improve our health, and they've led to the Endocrine Society releasing new guidelines in 2024, and they were much more modest in their claims. But despite the disappointments, the guidelines still point to situations where vitamin D supplements can be helpful, and one of those places is with kids. There are 2 reasons that this population can often benefit from vitamin D. The first is that it helps to prevent rickets, a condition where bones don't form properly. This is probably the best established benefit of vitamin D, and the search for a way to prevent rickets is what's led to the discovery of vitamin D in the first place. But the second reason that the guidelines give is that vitamin D supplements can potentially lower the risk of respiratory tract infections. So notice the key word here, potentially. It's a cautious endorsement, and that's because the evidence that we've seen so far is mixed. Some clinical trials found benefit, while others didn't. So for example, one trial is with 400 infants in China. Researchers were looking specifically at the impact of vitamin D on influenza A infections. They had two groups. One group got a low dose of vitamin D daily, and the other group got a high dose. And at the end of 4 months, there had been 121 cases of influenza A. 78 were in the low dose group. That's nearly twice as much as the 43 cases in the high dose group. And there were other interesting differences between the two groups as well. So for instance, the infants that got sick, the viral loads dropped much more quickly in the high-dose vitamin D group. Overall, the researchers of their study concluded that high-dose vitamin D, which was 1,200 international units in that case, clearly helped. But then there were similar studies conducted in Canada, and it looked at 700 kids aged between 1 to 5, and in that case, the focus wasn't specifically on the flu, but on all upper respiratory tract infections, and they used low and high-dose vitamin D groups. At the end of the study, the number of infections turned out to be basically the same. There was no statistically significant difference between the two groups. So the researchers' conclusion was the complete opposite to the China study. Vitamin D at higher doses didn't help reduce respiratory tract infections in that Canadian study. So does vitamin D actually help with infections or not? Well, a study that was just published sheds crucial light on the topic to help clarify the controversy. So this study involved 189 children in Denmark, and the purpose here was to investigate the effects of vitamin D supplements on respiratory tract infections. In this case, there was a placebo group and a separate group taking 25 micrograms or 1,000 international units of vitamin D daily over a period of 6 months during the winter. And here's what the trial showed. The children who took vitamin D had 17% fewer sick days from respiratory tract infections, and what's more, they had an incredible 43% fewer days with the respiratory tract infections that were accompanied with the fever. So what's the takeaway here? Well, the study results line up with the earlier study from China that found a benefit from vitamin D supplements, and the authors note that the dose seems to be critical. So recall that the China study had two groups, a low-dose group taking 400 international units, and a high-dose group taking 1,200 international units. The high-dose group had fewer infections. In this study, though, the dose was 1,000 units. That's a lot higher than the 400 currently recommended in Nordic countries. But why did they pick that dose? Well, partly it's due to earlier studies like the China study, which found effectiveness at doses near that level. But another part of the answer comes from a previous study by the same authors. In it, they found that daily vitamin D supplements of 800 units help to maintain normal immune system responses during infections. But in contrast, a daily dose of 400 units didn't seem to help. And I know what you're thinking here. The earlier study used 800 international units. So why does this new study in Denmark use 1,000 international units? Well, the authors of the new study wanted the kids to get a daily dose of 800 international units, but they realized that for normal kids, they're going to miss some doses. So they figured that the actual average intake with a 1,000 international unit dose would be about 800 units. But what about the Canadian study? It found no benefit at the doses of 200 units compared to the standard dose of 400. So what accounts here for the difference? The authors of the Denmark study point out a key factor that could help to explain the different results. Vitamin D levels, especially in northern countries like Denmark and Canada, they tend to drop significantly during the winter, and that's because the days are short and cold. People aren't getting the sunlight that stimulates vitamin D production in the skin. So the reason that vitamin D supplements would help in that population is that they keep the vitamin D levels from falling too low. And it looks like this is what explains the results from the Denmark study. The vitamin D levels were relatively high for all of the kids at the beginning of the study. They were just coming out of summer when the kids had spent a lot of time outside. By the end of the study, however, levels in the group that didn't take a supplement had dropped significantly. So about half of that group had levels below 50 nanomoles per litre. So why is that threshold significant? Well, it's the level that the Endocrine Society established back in 2011 as a boundary for deficiency. They've since backtracked a little bit, saying that we aren't confident about the right cutoffs for deficiency and sufficiency, but we do know that this level is relatively low. And this is where things get really interesting when we dig into the numbers for the Canadian study. At the end of the study, the average vitamin D levels were 92 nanomoles per litre in the low-dose group. That figure is even higher than the average for the children at the start of the Denmark study. So here's what's likely happening. Even at the lower doses, the participants in the Canadian study maintained their vitamin D levels high enough to reap the immune system benefits. So the extra vitamin D didn't help anything. So this new study, it adds more confidence to the Endocrine Society recommendations. It makes sense to supplement with vitamin D to help prevent and lessen the severity of respiratory tract infections in kids. And that's the reason why I give the correct dose of vitamin D to my 3 children. But preventing colds isn't the only use that the Endocrine Society guidelines recommend. So let's briefly look at 3 other groups where supplementing is suggested. The first is pregnant women. Supplementation during pregnancy can lower the risk of preeclampsia and preterm birth. It can even improve newborn health. So for that purpose, typical doses are around 3,000 international units daily. The second group is those who are at high risk of progressing to diabetes. Vitamin D could play a preventative role here, and studies suggest an average dose of about 3,500 international units daily. And the third group is adults 75 years and older. So as we age, the risk of death appears to decrease with vitamin D supplementation. But why does age matter so much? Well, as we get older, our skin becomes less efficient at producing vitamin D from sunlight. Our kidneys, which play a critical role in converting vitamin D to its active form, also start to slow down. So this is why the guidelines specifically call out older adults as a group that may benefit from regular vitamin D supplementation. It's about helping to maintain bone health, muscle function, and overall resilience as we age. But what if we aren't in any of these groups? How should we approach supplementing with vitamin D? Well, it's important to start with a caution. In contrast to what you'll hear from other social media influencers, we can actually get too much vitamin D. So consider this example. A 3-year clinical trial in Canada tested the impact of several daily doses of vitamin D. One group took 400 international units, another took 4,000, and the third took 10,000. Researchers were looking specifically at how this affected bone density. What they found was shocking. The groups who took higher doses didn't see improvements. In fact, it seemed to make things worse. So bone density in the wrist decreased by about 2.4% in the 4,000 international unit group and a whopping 3.5% in the 10,000 international unit group. There's also a study showing that higher doses of vitamin D seem to correlate with an increased risk of falls, and the authors of that study seem to indicate that higher levels of vitamin D might cause muscle weakness. So again, we have to be careful. So when it comes to vitamin D supplementation, more is definitely not always better. The latest Endocrine Society guidelines suggest following a recommended daily intake of 600 international units for younger adults and increasing that to 800 international units as you hit 50 and above. That dose is less than the previous Endocrine Society guidelines that we noted earlier. Now, the 600 to 800 international unit dose for the general population, it ensures that we aren't deficient in vitamin D and it locks in the known benefits. And that's why I reduced the dose of vitamin D and microvitamin from 2,000 to 1,000 international units when the new guidelines were released. There's also a relationship between vitamin D and vitamin K2 and magnesium, which is why I also included both of those in microvitamin. But just because I take a supplement does not in any way mean that you should as well. So just as I noted, we can get too much vitamin D, and there's another essential nutrient that lots of people take that we can get too much of, and when we do, we run the risk of damaging our blood vessels. So make sure to check out this next video here to find out if it's something that you're taking and whether your current dose is safe.